So you're back here with Looking Glass Forum. We're pushing back on the social media propaganda spin machine, defending our ability to think freely, and bringing you new levels of reason and logic that you're not currently permitted to think in the current politically correct structure. So welcome back here with Looking Glass Forum. Here we are in December 2020, and it's a very interesting time here. And if you take a close look at the different news headlines and the different news headline aggregators across the internet, if you look on MSN and you look on different internet websites that bring the really important information to you, you can see that we're experiencing a huge divide across the country as far as what is making sense and what is really the facts of reality, and what are the different reports that we can really trust that are grounded in the foundation of factual reality. And we have to really discuss what is factual reality. Is reality just whatever bias that we prefer to hear? So you can see that there's really just these dueling echo chambers, and our entire body politic is being pulled into these separate groups where people prefer to hear the news that they would like to be true. So it's a process of prognosticating or self-fulfilling prophecies that we're all engaged in, trying to visualize the future or visualize events as we would like them to be. And so we see this all across the political spectrum here. What it is you prefer to hear, what particular facts that you're trying to see come into being here as we move forward. On the mainstream websites with the typical social media groups that are going to just completely have derogatory headlines against Trump and calling him a stunt queen for trying to find a way to overturn the election results and to prove that there was fraud in the election. And on the other side, if you look at other news aggregators, you can see that they're following the constant attempt of Trump to find a way to find a legal remedy or to find a legislative remedy that could ultimately turn the tide here. And it's an interesting position that we're in politically, because we're so completely divided that we can no longer agree on what reality actually is. And the fact of the matter is that Joe Biden is not president-elect yet. And the fact is that Trump could completely lose this and have it stolen out from under him from a network of fraudulent ballots and computer hacking in the Dominion systems that basically made a landslide into a Trump loss. So from my point of view, it doesn't seem like that Trump has any reason to just give it up and concede. And if he doesn't concede, then somehow Joe Biden has to win. He has to take power. He has to get the president out of the White House and take over the presidency. And I'm not really sure how Joe Biden really goes about doing that. He's being really quiet about the fact that the Dominion machines are being explored, and there are websites and there's lawsuits going on, and they're taking the time in Michigan and other states to go through the voting machines carefully with forensic analysis. And the headlines on the other side of it, if you're over on the MSNBC, Microsoft, kind of CNN side of it, and you don't want to hear the facts, you're probably not hearing the fact that they're carefully finding a whole bunch of evidence that suggests that there was a massive voter fraud. And before, a week or two ago, this was dismissed as there was no evidence, there is nothing to say that there was any kind of voter fraud. But as we stand today, if you go ahead and look at some of the news articles that you might not prefer to read about because you like this alternate reality where Biden is already a shoo-in, he's already the president-elect, and he already basically won, he's picking his dream team cabinet. But if you look at the other side of the issue and go over to these other articles, it appears that Joe Biden is going to go down in flames. So we're in this dichotomy between two different places. I mean, we can't have two different presidents occupy one White House, so there has to be a winner. Ultimately, this fight is going to continue on, and it looks like that on the tech giant, Hollywood, influencer, mainstream media side of the issues, we're going to see the Democrat side of the issue here. We're going to have Twitter and Facebook trying to control the language, control the discussion, the narrative, and allow what news stories they deem to be reality or they see fit to release. are the only news stories that you're going to find really trending, and everything else is going to be blocked. So any kind of discussion about an alternate outcome to this election, which they do not prefer, they prefer for the deep state, kind of 45, 50 years in Washington, D.C., the swamp creature Biden and Harris to come in to take control, and that would be the outcome that they've been planning for, and that they see as the fit reality for us to see expressed on the internet and on their website. So the alternate to that, the other side of it, is that Trump is not conceding, and that as we move forward, despite all the shrill media hysteria over Trump being some kind of deranged lunatic for not conceding and not giving up, it looks like that there was a massive amount of voter fraud. And some of the state governors and some of the governors and the legislators are not really interested in hearing it, and they're just going to go ahead and certify these fraudulent election results. As it turns out, under law, you cannot certify fraudulent election results because they're fraudulent and they're incorrect and they're wrong. So ultimately, it takes some time to go through it all. But we don't have to really focus on the January dates, and we have to recognize that one of the Lincoln elections went all the way until, I believe it was the middle of March before it was finally settled. So this fight that Trump's putting up can go on for a long time, and ultimately it's not really about Trump, it's really about what the state legislators decide they want to do, because the election is decided not by popular votes or the fraudulent ballots that were stuffed into the ballot boxes. Those can all be easily dismissed. It really comes down to the state legislators and which actual electors they're going to send, and then ultimately in the Congress and in the Senate which electors they're going to dare accept. So we have to all become constitutional scholars and experts to understand how this is going to play out. But the media is really not doing us any justice by just pretending like Joe Biden already won, because he really didn't, and ultimately this thing could flip over and Trump could really overturn it. And it's not just a nightmare scenario, but it's an actual reality of a fact here that we have to really contend with if we're going to be rational people. So it would be nice just to stick wax in our ears, because we don't want to hear anything more from Trump, because we don't like him, and just assume that Biden's dream team is going to win and they're going to do the Green New Deal and just do everything that on the other side of the political aisle that they would like to see. But ultimately, Biden did not win, and it doesn't look like he's really doing much to really increase his chances of really winning here, because ultimately, if they show that the Dominion voting system is incorrect, and that ultimately these mail-in ballots are cast out, all of a sudden you're going to find out that Donald Trump is going to be inaugurated. And I think that's going to be earth-shattering if that's what actually happens. And all that really has to happen for this to go Biden's way is for Trump to concede and just back off and give up and just accept the status quo. But I don't think he's going to do that. And I don't think the state legislature is going to do that either. I mean, Texas had almost 20 states behind their lawsuit, and it really doesn't matter if the Supreme Court knocks that down or not, because the Supreme Court isn't really in charge of the electors. In fact, the fact that they knocked that down and slapped it down really gave more fuel to the fire for the people that are, the legislators and the lawyers that are trying to push this idea that there was election fraud, and ultimately Donald Trump really won. So what it comes down to is that you can't have a false winner. You can't have a guy who lost the election, like in Biden's case, and they had a bunch of Dominion voting software shenanigans that flipped hundreds of thousands of votes to Biden, and they have a bunch of mail-in ballots that were never folded or never mailed in and never in an envelope. If it's shown that these fraudulent ballots were filled out in haste and were just counted over and over and over again by using some of the tabulation machines error modes, it's really what's being shown, that there was a lot of unscrupulous activity, a lot of pre-planned ballots that were basically set up for Biden by the tens of thousands and accounted repeatedly in order to basically show when the Dominion voting machine tabulators were in an error mode, instead of resetting them, they just allowed the error mode to allow the machine to stay in error mode and tabulated and counted false ballots over and over and over again. And this is really, as it's being proved and it's being shown out county by county in Michigan and Maricopa County and some of the other areas, this is a lot of the information that the other side of the political aisle doesn't want to hear. They would rather just gouge their eardrums out with hot pokers than to hear all this conspiracy mumbo jumbo. But it's really very serious stuff. And ultimately, on the left side of the aisle, they don't want to imagine that Joe Biden could be totally ousted, him and his whole dream team. But you have to understand, this is a sitting president, and the incoming president doesn't really have any kind of political power. For the last 4 years, Donald Trump has been set up, there in Washington, and he has his whole team in place. So he has a lot of emergency authority. He has martial law capacity, and ultimately, if it's being borne out to the American people and to Donald Trump that this election was stolen, that he was really the winner, he has absolutely no reason to give up the presidency, and he probably won't. And there's really nothing that Twitter or MSNBC or Joe Biden or Hollywood or anybody can really do about it. You can go out in the streets with Antifa and try to burn shit down, and you can go and jump over the fence of the White House and try to cause havoc with this George Soros funded, the Obama-backed paramilitary groups that the Democrats have out there marching around, Black Lives Matter and so on. But these groups are going to be countered by some of the other groups that are starting to step up, like Proud Boy groups and so on and so forth. It's just going to ultimately end up in this huge street melee and a power struggle that's going to go down in the streets of Washington, D.C. here as I'm looking at it. But ultimately, Donald Trump doesn't have any real right to give up or concede if it wasn't a real defeat. So on one side, you have the news aggregators, you have the Twitter and Google and MSNBC and these other groups that are just refusing to listen to any of the other side of the debate. But on the other side of the debate, we have multiple states, legislatures, multiple state Supreme Courts, and we actually have the Republican side of it has control of a huge influence within the Congress and within ultimately after the runoff, the senatorial runoff campaigns there and in Georgia, the Republican side of this is going to control the outcome of the election because ultimately the Supreme Court has shown no interest, and as they continue to flap away all the different lawsuits that are coming up to them, it's ultimately going to fall to the Congress to decide which electors they're going to choose. And you can see that the different states they've sent Biden electors, but they've also sent Trump electors to Congress. So Congress will have the power to choose which electors they're ultimately going to accept. And if it can be shown to them convincingly that there was an inordinate amount of voter fraud and that the true winner is Trump, then they have no reason to accept the fraudulent Biden electors. Despite all the power plays that were put forward in the states by the attorney generals of the states and by the governors of the states, ultimately these different states are being controlled by Republican legislatures, and they don't have any reason to accept the fraudulent outcome. The Dominion voting systems and the mail-in balloting process has been fraught with irregularities and fraud, so that to the point that we don't, as an American people, have to accept a false outcome. Obviously, the Biden people, Twitter, Facebook, Google, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, lots of actors, China, these are international actors, China, Russia, other people had different reasons why they wanted to invest into this confusion and ensure that it wouldn't be a clean, straight up or down vote. But there would be all this confusion and all this different kind of stopping the vote, counting and starting with different people coming in at different times in the middle of the night to add ballots and to do all this different kind of fraudulent criminal activity. And now the fact that, Facebook, Twitter, MSNBC, Google, nobody's going to allow there to be any discussion about this election, and ultimately you're going to be censored, and you're going to be your opinion is going to be blocked if you want to express the idea that, wait a second, this wasn't really a clean election. Ultimately, this kind of power play is going to push the Republicans and really the patriots who are interested in having a fair electoral process in the United States, it's going to push them to these extremes where they're going to use the Constitution, the process that they have, and they ultimately don't have to accept a fraudulent outcome. They don't have to accept hundreds, 500,000 extra votes being added in for Biden, and everyone just go away and say, yeah, Biden won. I just don't think that that's going to happen. And ultimately, in reality, you're when you look on your phone, on your smart device, I don't know if it's a smart device or a dumb device, because you're ultimately being dumbed down by the control that Silicon Valley has over the information flow. And while they're able to control what people really know and what they read, and the news articles are going to be basically trending and the ones that are going to be censored and shadow banned, ultimately the American people themselves and really the state legislatures don't have to accept this uniform, ubiquitous deception that's happening. Ultimately, they can say, you know what, we've seen enough. We realize now that in our state there was fraud in the election, that Trump won, and we're sending our Trump electors up to Washington, D.C. so that the Congress and the Senate there can accept the Trump victory. So that's kind of what's being set up in the background. There's no discussion of it. And, Jake Tapper is finally going to come out and say, yep, there was a Hunter Biden laptop which had a bunch of with a bunch of images of him and videos of him smoking crack and doing pornographic stuff. And the fact that the DOJ is going to investigate the Biden family, and ultimately Biden at this point, despite claiming that he's in this office of the president-elect, there really is no office of the president-elect. I mean, this is just factual reality, and he really isn't the president-elect yet. So a lot of these investigations of their corruption in the Biden family that are not being reported on Twitter, that are not being reported in Time magazine, they're not being reported in the public space so that you can hear it. Ultimately, you have to go to some podcasts and you go to people that are really interested in these investigations and who are delving into it to find them. But it's not going to be in the mainstream. Okay, so Hollywood, mainstream media, social media networks, everywhere in the popular social public space, you're going to be blocked or ridiculed if you suggest that Trump probably is going to win this thing. And it's really just up to him ultimately. If he concedes, then he concedes and he gets out of the way and he allows this kind of fraudulent electoral system to push Biden into power. But ultimately, Trump just has to sit in the seat and say, I won. And there really is nothing that Biden can do to unseat him at this point. There's really no maids or security personnel. There's no Secret Service agents who are going to come over to Trump and tap him on the shoulder and say, hey, Trump, it's time for you to leave now. You lost. Ultimately, Trump is going to say, I won. The different legislatures in those states that were fraudulent are going to continue to fight this out. They're not just going to let it go, despite whatever McConnell said. I heard what McConnell said in the Senate, but it didn't really sound like he was giving much room for Biden-Harris campaign. It seemed like it was more of a ridicule and kind of an inside joke, because he said, congratulations to your 40-plus years of being here in Washington. I mean, it seems like it's Mitch McConnell's way of just kind of tongue-in-cheek tipping the hat to this fraudulent and now disgraced Biden-Harris campaign. Their team is a total disgrace, and it's kind of embarrassing. I think they're in a panic mode there in Washington, D.C. It's not prevalent. It's not obvious when you look on the news aggregators, when you look at headlines, that you just see all this contempt and vitriol that's just put forth constantly on Trump. So there's just constant Trump hate all the time. And so for the thinker, for the American, spectator on the outside of this, it becomes obvious that the media system, that the deep state power structure really hates Trump, and we're all supposed to put on a mask, hate Trump, and try to support the Biden situation. But in reality, despite who you're voting for, whether you voted for Biden or Trump, it would have been unacceptable if there was millions and hundreds of thousands of false ballots for Trump, and if there was millions of false votes in the Dominion voting system that pushed Trump over the top and gave him a false victory. That would be illegal and it would be unconscionable. And the same thing is true on the other side of it when it's your candidate and you really want Biden to win, if they used false tactics. And I think that's really the problem here, is that they cheated too much. They went way over the top. They cheated so obviously and so desperately. They had to overcome a substantial Trump lead in the millions. So they had to produce literally, 4 or 5 million false votes, false ballots, false Dominion voting machine irregularities, the rigging of the voting machines to give Trump votes over to Biden so that they could have this appearance, this optics of a Biden-Harris win, when it's really just all fictitious and it's all fraudulent. So I think that the people on the other side of it who are accepting this fraudulent win are not questioning it, who have drunk the Kool-Aid of the social media giants, the tech giants, the technocracy out there that's just decided that they'll determine what reality is for us all. And they've decided early on what the election results were really going to be before they were even tabulated. Everyone kind of knew that the fix was in. So as this is all being exposed day by day, I think it's like watching a slow-moving train wreck at this point, because ultimately the country and the grown-ups in the government don't have to accept a fraudulent Biden-Harris victory. They just don't have to accept it. And that's what the whole point of the Electoral College is. If there was millions of fraudulent votes that were later, dumpster fired or burned, all these different security envelopes that the mail-in ballots supposedly came in were completely destroyed, or they never existed at all. There's no signature verification forms. So all these different COVID-19 regulations that the polling locations and the state governments decided they would just employ in violation of the constitutional voting process. Once all that's really thrown out and you really can't count those questionable ballots anymore, and you're seeing that in the Wisconsin state court, the Supreme Court there in Wisconsin, I mean, things are basically starting to slowly turn around as more and more of this evidence is being produced. And the fact that you destroyed the evidence, or that you destroyed the envelopes, or that you don't have any envelopes to show, all these irregularities are going to be really, and there's not a jury of our peers or 12 juries that have to decide this. The jury that has to decide this are the state legislatures. The state legislatures are the ones that Giuliani has been sitting in front of. They have been meticulously going to each state legislature to show that there was this massive fraud, and that they have no reason to honor or keep faith with these false results, so that the popular election is completely moot, it's completely corrupted, and that they really need to ultimately cast the deciding presidential electors to Washington, D.C. on their own. And that's what they've done. On one side, you have the Biden electors, and as those are being proven to be fraudulent, the standing of those Biden electors in Washington, D.C. is going to become more and more undermined, so that they have less and less confidence. And, as the media scrum starts to surround them, as people start to ask more and more questions, it's going to become more and more clear that the Biden electors are really fraudulent electors, and so that the Trump electors were sent up to represent the true will of the people. So you have to understand the dynamic here. If the will of the people was to vote for Trump, and that there was a huge conspiratorial action on the side of the Biden campaign, on the Dominion voting systems, on the mail-in ballots, and on the counting process, and in 100 different ways, they were able to basically wag the dog and change the outcome of the election from what the American people wanted to what the Biden clique wanted. Then ultimately, the state legislatures have no interest. They have no reason to serve Biden's cause in these fraudulent proceedings and in these criminal actions. And ultimately, I think that Trump is going to start to, you're going to start to see people arrested. You're going to see that this whole thing is going to come unraveled in a most epic way. And so Trump has a lot of time. It seems like he's running out of time, but it really ultimately has a lot of time to slow drip out this information and to build up the pressure on this whole situation, so that the appearance of a de facto win in all corners here. Everywhere you look on the internet, every different app you go onto your phone, there's this kind of ubiquitous censorship and narrative control. So they're going to control the whole discussion, the dialogue, to the point that anyone who resists this idea that Biden has an automatic victory and that there was just a totally clean election and that really 80 million people came out and voted for Biden is really just only permissible discussion and conversation that's really allowed to be had. So as Trump really looks over the different evidence here, and as he sends his lawyers, and as people investigate, and each of the states too are motivated to root out any kind of corruption or fraudulent electoral election shenanigans that were taking place. They don't have any reason to allow there to be a criminal fraud in their state. So there's a lot of senators and congressmen and judges in these different states, in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, who have an axe to grind. They have to make their name in politics. They have to show the people that they represent in their districts that they're going to fight the good fight, and they're not just going to, Biden and Harris can't pay off everyone in the entire world to do their bidding. Ultimately, there's people that are going to be self-motivated. There's going to be lawyers, journalists, and politicians who are just going to say, hey, wait a second, we haven't drunk the Kool-Aid of this, and we can see that there's an iron curtain of ignorance that's being descended and lowered down over this whole discussion. But it looks like that the presidential election of 2020 was totally fraudulent, and there was a lot of illegal activity that helped try to push Biden over the finish line. You can see early in the night, and that night in November 3rd, when they were doing the counting process, you can see that Trump had a huge lead and was going to win, and ultimately they stopped the counting. They brought in a bunch of fraudulent votes. There was a whole bunch of computer hacking, and it's interesting that the CISA, the cybersecurity federal agency, recently had the head fired because he said that it was a safe and clean election, and it turns out that was completely untrue. So if this was a widespread conspiracy to try to make sure that Biden was put into office, then Trump has nothing better to do with his time than to totally pull the strings of it and just completely unwind it, the whole thing. So he couldn't unwind a conspiracy to commit fraud on a criminal level in this election if there was nothing there. But if there is something there, he can pull at the threads of it, and he can totally untangle it, and ultimately people are going to start falling, and we will have people that will start to. Right now, there are subpoenas going out all over Michigan. The head of Dominion and Smartmatic are being subpoenaed. Over 10 state legislatures are fighting and sending different electors to Washington than Biden expects. So to think that you can just put on Google, look at the different censored stories, the acceptable stories, and just say, hey, Biden won, is completely really deranged, because you're not really seeing the full picture. And this is what you have when you have this dichotomy, this split in reality, these dueling echo chambers where people are going to just decide to imbibe the information that they would like to hear, and that it's acceptable to them, and later on it's going to be totally I think on the Trump side, everyone's aware that he might lose. He could lose this. But on the Biden side, I think the people are totally brainwashed to the extent that they're not prepared to find out that the Congress is going to decide to re-elect Trump. And ultimately, they're going to choose to hear out these complaints about fraud. They're going to look at the evidence, and they're going to see Biden lost. There was a bunch of illegal activity, and Trump is going to just be the next president of the United States. So I think that's the thing that you're not allowed to say. Those are the thoughts that you're not allowed to think. You're not allowed to be suspicious of this election if you think that there was voting irregularities and fraudulent ballots and Dominion voting machine manipulation. Then you have to be cast out of polite society. You have to be pushed out. And I think that's ultimately what Google and Twitter and Facebook and Silicon Valley are in the process of doing now. They're trying to find out who is the dissenting voices and to squash them. So you're not allowed to have a different opinion. You have to have this universal single mindset that they're trying to produce. And ultimately, I think they're trying to take away the POTUS Twitter handle. They're going to do all these different things. And ultimately, as the evidence is being borne out and it becomes clear that Trump is going to win, I think that there'll be a total blackout. This confederacy, this deep state confederacy that they call it, that really has to do with keeping the central bank, Federal Reserve power structure in place, and having to do with the Hollywood celebrity elite and the Silicon Valley technocracy elite that's out there, and it really has to do with them maintaining their power. So it's really about all of John Brennan and James Comey and James Clapper and really just the Obama intelligence operatives who really brought this on themselves by going so hard against the Trump campaign, trying to destroy the Trump campaign before it had even been inaugurated into office, when they realized that Hillary Clinton was going to lose. And so I think this was just a replay of the 2016 election where they gamed it out for the last 4 years, and they decided that they were just not going going to allow there to be a technical win by the Trump administration. So they had every different trick in the book. They had different counties, different areas, and different swing states, and it had it all set up. They even brought in the different ballots in different areas overnight, and they were acting like the deep state cabal that the right accuses them of being. So they were not interested in really hearing the judgment or the will of the American people. It was a coup d'etat against the democratic process. It was really the Obama acolytes who are just trying to get back into power. You already see this Samantha Powers and so some of these other Obama sycophants that are out there that are interested in just getting themselves back into power, surrounding Hillary Clinton and the whole Clinton situation. So it's just going to bring back another era of corruption if Biden gets into play. I mean, it's obvious that Biden is a completely geriatric moron who's completely shot out. His brain doesn't work or function anymore at all, and that his family is a bunch of corrupt crackhead, stripper dating, sellouts to China. And it's so obvious on the face of it that the Biden family is corrupt and really perverted. They have an issue with sexual perversion that's just completely demonstrable, and it's really sickening. And ultimately, you're having them being pushed into power by the deep state movers and shakers, the George Soros types, those people out there who are not interested in letting the United Nations lose power, the World Trade Organization to lose its power, the World Health Organization. These are the globalists that are not interested in seeing what Trump's going to do next. So they're completely invested, they're all in, and they have committed a level of traitorous criminality here against America, so that they're serving the Chinese and the Russian hackers, interested in serving their masters there in China, and ultimately, serving their masters there in the European Union too. Now, and as I'm looking through the different headlines, we have all this criticism of Trump at every possible level that's almost inhuman. It's incomprehensible level of criticism. You'd think that the man was really just the Antichrist, and then you have this adulation, this glowing adoration of Joe Biden that's really just sickening because he's a complete moron. And ultimately, the tech giants and Twitter and the MSN, NBC webpage and all these different groups know that Biden is really just a sellout. He's been a Washington swamp creature for 40 years. He hasn't done anything. I mean, when he was younger, he was marching around and supporting white racists, and now down in the Georgia Senate election, he's supporting this black fellow who's an out-and-out anti-Semite, racist against white people. So he's gone from supporting white racists to now black liberal communist racists who hate white people. So there's just the Democratic Party has completely come unhinged as it's trying to move forward these different nonsensical platforms of propaganda. So you have the New Green Deal, you have this pro-Palestine, anti-Israel platform, you have this Black Lives Matter, all white people are racist platform. You have all these extremists, and you have the communists, the neo-Marxists front that's coming into the party, and ultimately we're bringing in this monstrous amalgamation of corruption and anti-American zealotry. Really, it's just extremism. And really, these are the purposes and the outlet of China. China is looking for these extremists, for these anti-American political agitators to serve the purpose of empowering China and disempowering American freedom and American democratic institutions across the West here. So this is an existential fight that we're engaged in. And I just don't think that Trump is ultimately to just put it down and go away and go to retire in Florida. I mean, it's possible. I mean, obviously it's possible that on the other side of the spectrum, the left is pushing really hard to try to shoo in their de facto victory, to try to just quiet and quell any discussion about any kind of voter fraud or Dominion voting machines that could have Smartmatic, the whole discussion about the solar winds hack that had to do with the Dominion voting machines that probably allowed, Chinese and Russian actors to come in and just completely screw with the election any kind of way they wanted, and all the COVID regulations that allowed for people to change rules around the polling stations and allowing the actual election process at the polling locations, so that observers couldn't allow the counting process. So all these COVID restrictions are ultimately unconstitutional. Just because there's a COVID situation out there doesn't mean that you can suddenly just reformat, retool the entire election process in order to favor the candidate that you would like to win. So ultimately, cooler heads are going to prevail. There's a lot of people within the judiciary, within the Supreme Court, within these different state Supreme Courts, and within the legislators that don't really have any reason to just let this go and to just let Biden win without any kind of struggle. So I think there ultimately is going to be a struggle here, and we can see on one side that there's a lot of media pressure. We could see McConnell who finally came out in the Senate and called Joe Biden president-elect, and the media takes that as a huge concession and a huge victory on their part, because they're really just trying to really pull off this fraud. So in any area where they can start to see the Republicans give in to their mode of interpreting reality here, and to the narrative that they're putting forth in order to describe this as a new Biden-Harris presidential victory, they're going to take advantage of it. But on the other side, you have to recognize that right here on the front of Microsoft Network, MSN.com, I can see a news article that shows that on the Democratic, on the liberal left side of this whole thing, that there are breaks, and that they're starting to recognize that the Biden victory is far from complete. Just to make that point, I'll read this news article here in The Hill, and this is being posted on the front of MSN.com right there in their search engine. You can see that this story is being posted, and I'm sure that it says Jeffrey D. Mayer is the contributor who did this article, and I'm sure he's going to take a lot of heat for just having this really totally rational discussion in this article. And he's going to point out here, and I'll just go ahead and read it. It says, "No, Biden hasn't won yet. One more nightmare scenario." So with the Supreme Court's rejection of the Texas lawsuit, it's over, right? Not so fast. Trump has one more card to play, depending on whether Republicans in Congress are more loyal to Trump than they are to the country. After the electoral votes are cast, they have to be accepted by Congress. By law, the House and Senate meet together on January 6th, and if any state's ballots are changed by one member of the House and Senate, the chambers must meet separately and vote on the challenge. Given that 126 members of Congress signed on to the Texas lawsuit to overturn Joe Biden's victory, and that many GOP senators have not accepted Biden as the president-elect, some states are going to be challenged. Here's where things get interesting. The controlling federal law, the Electoral Count Act, the ECA, is more than 100 years old, opaque, and has never been fully used, and it may not even be constitutional. The Congress over which the old vice president will be presiding will be the new one, which is Pence. Sworn in January 3rd, the new House, narrowly Democratic, will vote down any challenge, but the Senate, something very different could occur. Let's suppose that the balance is 52-48 Republican, and blah, 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 blah. It talks about Mitt Romney and Susan Collins and all these questionable votes. And even if the Senate votes to uphold the challenges, the ECA has a tie-breaking provision. Any slate of electors that is certified by their state's governor will be accepted if the House and Senate disagree. Biden, again, could win. Thus, the New York Times assumes that Republican challenges to the electoral votes would be futile. But if the Senate never finishes voting, it's going to go on and just point out the fact that the certification of the election and the sending in of the electors to Washington, D.C. is far from a done deal. And ultimately, as they're starting to prove more and more of the election fraud, and is empowering the Republican side of the Congress and the Senate to really make the choice to choose the Trump electors. And ultimately, this could produce a Trump victory. And I think that that's really what we're going to see happen here as we're moving forward. And ultimately, no one wants to really talk about it. Ultimately, this whole idea is completely censored. And you have to understand that those who are interested in supporting the Communist Chinese Party and who are really enacting this coup d'etat, this overthrow of the American government by dismissing and fraudulently turning over the will of the American people to vote for Donald Trump and to place him as the next president of the United States. Ultimately, this whole scheme, these power players have a lot of influence in Silicon Valley. They can control what people's cell phones are telling them. They can control the news articles that people are allowed to read. They're able to, on CNN, Jake Tapper and all them can really just control the narrative of what people are hearing at a broad scale. So you really have side of the discussion here, and that being the fact that Trump is pushing to become the next president and to assert that he was the real winner despite the fraudulent election results. And ultimately the whole discussion is going to be pushed to the fringe. So you're taking 75 million people or 73 million people and their votes, and you're pushing them out of the public space and pushing them into the fringe so that their ideas and their opinions are no longer heard. And when you do that, you've created a false environment. You've created a literal echo chamber where you're only hearing what you would, Jack Dorsey or the Facebook kind of tyrants. They're just really going to only allow the opinion that they want to hear expressed only. And when you do that, you're really empowering the most extreme segments in the right, in the Republican Party, disallowing any dissent or any alternative or voices of opposition from speaking. So that really what we're seeing is the enshrinement of election fraud, so that elections no longer have any meaning, and you're debasing the entire democratic process of the entire nation. And that's really just to uphold one winner one time in one election process, and you're corrupting the entire future process going forward. So I think that's really why we're going to see some of the Supreme Court and some of the elements within the federal government begin to step in and to take control of the situation. And ultimately, I don't think that Biden is going to really be inaugurated or have his power. And if he ultimately is, he'll be a totally disgraced presidency who's really being indicted on so many different levels. There's a special counsel, and this one isn't just based on some kind of fake Russia hoax, but this is really based on the fact that the Bidens have taken tens and tens of millions of dollars from China over the course of time and enriched themselves, really serving the interests of our enemies. And so his presidency is going to be completely fraught with problems so that he'll just be a completely disempowered and neutered president. And Kamala Harris can't really do anything either. She can try to step into the presidency, but to wield that kind of power and to have the State Department respect you or the military respect you, able to put together an actual governing, a cohesive, workable government is not such a simple thing right now for Biden-Harris campaign. I think that they're just intent on taking power for power's sake, just for sheer political avarice, and ultimately to try to sidestep some of the indictments and some of the investigations into the Biden and really Kamala Harris herself, some of the financial dealings. And ultimately we can expect them to try to pack the court and do some of the other extreme new Green Deal things that they've been trying to get at. And this is all while we're printing out $1 trillion Federal Reserve deficits, and there's no move to address this kind of collapse. So this is how we're going to get to this point where we have this great reset. So when I say that this is an existential fight, it really is. Ultimately, Trump has no reason to give up, and the American people have every right and expectation that Trump is going to continue to fight and ultimately cast down this whole push for Biden-Harris to create this neo-Marxist coalition government with China and with all this Chinese corruption, Chinese communist corruption that we've been seeing that's coming out. And ultimately the tax indictments are going to go against Hunter Biden. And all that was completely repressed by the technocracy, by Twitter and Google. I mean, the New York Post article was actually deplatformed. New York Post is deplatformed off Twitter just because they said that there there was some issues surrounding Hunter Biden, and now Jake Tapper is going to come out and say that all that was really true. I mean, ultimately, you got censored and you got flagged on Twitter, and you had a little veil put over your comments as fact-checked incorrectly, and ultimately, we're going to find out that all those fact-checkers were just political bullshit. And so the American people are really going to see through all this, and you can control all these instruments of media, of social media, of internet activity. You can control Google. You can control a lot. You can control Biden. You can control Hollywood. You can control what's popular. But ultimately, you can't control what the American people are going to think. And when they're starting to recognize that there's this huge confederacy of neo-Marxist leftist collaborators. We're not talking about liberals. Liberals are good. We need liberty. We need liberation. We need libertines. We're talking about the communist, neo-Marxist leftists out there that are here to topple the government and to spend us into oblivion and basically weaken, just the way that Obama weakened the military. They're here to destroy the United States and to use the apparatus and the institutions and the democratic functions to destroy and to win at all means, at every means available to them. That's why they didn't hesitate to cheat on the election. They didn't hesitate to hack into the Dominion voting systems and the Dominion officials and the VPs at Dominion and Smartmatic guaranteed to Antifa that they would produce a Biden victory, even though it was impossible. Even though I think Biden only got 43 million votes and Trump got 72 million, they were able to manipulate various states. I mean, we can see spikes during the night where suddenly Biden has 400,000 more votes in one 30-minute period. So, I mean, it's obvious election fraud. I don't think they cared. They just really wanted to get to the next stage of their Great Reset. Ultimately, they didn't have a war. The COVID thing is breaking down. That's no longer really an excuse because now we have a vaccine. So it's really time to take off the mask. It's time to go back to being normal Americans. We can clean our minds from all the brainwash that the media has been putting us through. The propaganda mill has been putting us through it. But ultimately, it's time for us to take back our minds, to unmask ourselves. If we want to take a vaccine, take a vaccine. But it's ultimately time for us to take our country back. I think that many, many people's eyes are being opened to how much that the deep state cabal, the international set, the kind of the globalist billionaire power structure that's out there that's tied with the Georgetown set that really controls Washington politics and really directs our nation, how much control it really has over our lives and over our thinking. So there's really no law that's been set that says you have to wear a mask, but ultimately, this whole kind of paradigm has been raised that if you don't wear a mask, then you might end up having people complain. You might end up having to deal with cops. In some areas, you might be arrested. Thanksgiving dinner might be have a SWAT team come through and kick in your door if you had too many people at your Thanksgiving dinner. And these are all violations of the Constitution. And these are supposedly the attempts of the government to protect the citizenry against the virus. But these were really ultimately a global governance, a deep state world government of elites that are trying to control our country and control what happens all around the world, so that everywhere you go, if you listen carefully to what people are saying, if you go into Afghanistan or if you go to Kabul or if you go to Peru, I mean, everywhere people are being required to wear these masks, and there's really no sense of where this direction is coming from. It's just coming from above. It's coming from the people who tell us what to do. If you're on a college campus, then the administrative staff and their bosses are telling you, or if you have a job, if you want to keep your job, or if you want to enter into a business, or on every level, you're being informed that and dictated to. It's really just a global dictatorship, and it's not coming from one individual, but it's coming from an entire cabal of individuals who are really determining for us how life is going to be and how our lives are going to be. And so you have Fauci coming out and saying that maybe this pandemic will last into another year, maybe another 2 years, maybe next summer. And they're just kind of arbitrarily making it up as they go. And these are supposed to be scientists. These are supposed to be the intelligentsia that we all need to listen to. And it's really just time for us, whether we're Republicans or Democrats, to recognize that we're being condescended to and we're being treated like like we're being treated like children, like little peasants, and ultimately we can determine for ourselves what's best. And it looks like to me that there's really no reason to wear these masks. These masks really don't help anything. They're really just stifling, and they're really just symbols of control over us. And as I'm going through some of these news articles, I can see some people that are questioning what's happening with Biden. I can see a whole lot of criticism of Trump, but I constantly see these pictures, the Christmas cards for the royal family for the last 10 years, all these pictures of Prince Harry and his wife, and Kate Middleton, and all the royals, and there's this constant gushing and adulation and this worship of the royals there in England. And it's obvious to me that it's just exactly what Voltaire said. And he said, if you want to know who rules over you, all you need to do is find out who you're not allowed to criticize. And so in this case, we're not allowed to criticize the royals. We're not allowed to criticize the monarchy of England, okay? You're not allowed to do it if you're on MSNBC. You're not allowed to do it if you're on Twitter or Google. Even if you're Puff Daddy, or you're not allowed to criticize. So ultimately, this is really where we can see that the power structure that's directing all these events is really coming from. And now, on another subject here, I hear a really interesting discussion that's coming up surrounding the question of and this is becoming highly political, but the question of homosexuality and really where we stand. And we have this phalanx of political correctness across college campuses, across the re-education programs that are happening within government, within academia, and within all these different areas of our cultural, social life. So in Hollywood, the big tech think tanks are going to disallow any kind of differing opinion. So, obviously we don't like haters. Nobody likes racism, or nobody likes, people who, let's use a word, homophobic. I mean, are you afraid of gay people? Or if you just don't like gay people, it's something that you're not familiar with. It's not part of your culture. So when you see homosexual people, it throws people off. It's okay to be educated and learn that people are out there, they have homosexual lifestyles, and that's really not very unusual. If we look back in history, we can go back to the ancient empires in the past and see that this is something that's been with us as a part of normal society for a very long time. Now, the question is, when we get into the protection of all things homosexual, so it goes past like the idea that there might be a homosexual couple who wants to have the recognition of being married, who wants to have legal standing so that they can go into hospitals and care for their loved ones, even though they don't have a typical heterosexual male-female relationship. They want to be recognized in a legal setting so that their relationship is qualified as a marriage, and that their lives have connected and been united, and in that way that we understand as matrimony. And so we're going well past that kind of basis, which is totally reasonable, to the LGBTQ thing, to where we're getting into the transgendered identity politics, and ultimately the question of where are we empowering unhealthy behavior? Where are we calling people who have legitimate mental illness and who are participating in very dangerous behaviors, and we're just going to cover that as something that's unable to be criticized, unable to be questioned because of the current state of political correction and political ideology. So when it comes down to the question of, are we going to allow 12 and 13-year-old girls to take body and mind changing hormones like testosterone and these different kind of powerful medications that totally alter your body? Are we going to allow those children to take these kind of powerful medications because they have been around other peers that decided that they no longer want to be girls, but they want to be men? And in order to make that happen, because they know everything, because they're 13, they're going to go behind their parents' back and go ahead and start taking these hormones from a doctor without a prescription, and the schools and the school administrations, the teachers and the counselors and even the doctors are going to conspire and lie to the parents so that teenage girls can receive these gender reassigning hormone supplements, even against the wishes of their own parents. side of the discussion, you would hear people say, well, listen, it's very dangerous to force people who don't feel comfortable in their own skin and who feel like their real gender is a man, and that they no longer want to be identified as a female, and that life is unlivable, and that it's an excruciating, uncomfortable, and unpleasant experience to be continued to be forced to live as a girl when they feel inside that their real gender is a man, and so that the only safe, sane, and humane thing to do is to let these individuals who feel like that they need to become a man, to take these gender reassigning chemicals in order to become a man, and they needed to do that early because when they're older, they don't want to live their adult life as a female, but they want to live their adult life as a male, so they need to take these gender reassigning hormones at a younger age. And of course, since the parents aren't going to really be helpful, we'll just lie to the parents and we'll just take the kids in school and take them to start taking these hormones. This is the kind of debate that we're getting. We're going past the convenience of allowing people to have a matrimony status between same-sex couples that wasn't recognized earlier on in our history, and now we're going into having kids who haven't even finished puberty yet deciding that they're going to reassign their genders, and this is just all part and parcel of the same political discussion. So we really need to do what we always do and get into a very difficult conversation here about what is perversion and what is really healthy relationships. And I don't know how many people you've been exposed to in the world and how much experience you have, but I've seen it both ways. I've seen it where I've found very healthy, happy gay couples who seem to be very well adjusted. They're educated. They seem to be monogamous. Like I said before, I don't know that all homosexual relationships are just automatically natural. I don't know that that's the case. I think that some people are acting out and on a neurotic and a psychopathological way, and that ultimately, these mental illnesses, they can't be hidden behind the fact that somebody just, well, I'm gay. Well, you can be gay, but ultimately, if you have mental illness and you have perversity and you're acting out inappropriately towards children, or you're having other dysfunctions, that can't be masked behind being gay. Okay, and people who are trying to identify as gay are also people that can deal with intense mental illness or sexual repression, or in many cases having been sexually molested when they were younger. And these are all lead to problems that can be expressed as an adult, and people are many times acting out in the most unhealthy and most destructive sexual practices, and they're not being addressed because people are simply saying, well, you can't criticize me, you can't question the state of my condition because I'm a protected victim group, I'm a homosexual, and that's not always the case. Sometimes people are being pushed or being assigned to this category of LGBTQ, but really they're really sexual predators, and they're really having sexual perversity, issues with having sexual perversity. And we need to be able to distinguish the two. You can't just go into the LGBTQ community and be protected on all levels of sexual deviation. So ultimately, like I said, I've seen people who are claiming to be homosexuals who are struggling with terrible sexual deviation, terrible perversion, and have terrible struggles with mental illness. And then on the other side of it, I've seen people who are perfectly healthy, perfectly mentally healthy, people who are homosexual couples who are fit to be parents and to have kids who have no home, who need to be adopted somewhere, should certainly go to these groups. Just like any couple, you could find a couple who's a heterosexual couple who's healthy, who's well adjusted, doing well, and who are parent material, and then you have heterosexual couples who are drug addicted, who are perverted, who have mental illness, and just them saying, well, I'm a heterosexual couple doesn't get to shield them from the discussion we need to have about their mental illness or their sexual deviations or their perversity. And so we're going to get into this discussion, and let's listen to a very interesting interview that we have here. the Daily Signal, and this is really going to be Nicole Russell, and she's going to bravely come out and discuss what the United Kingdom has long been on the progressive end of the transgender issue. So when they pump the brakes, America should pay attention. And this is here on this this podcast with this interview with Nicole Russell. A high court in the United Kingdom recently ruled that children 16 years old and younger cannot be treated with puberty-blocking hormone drugs unless a court specifically rules otherwise. So let's get into this discussion that we're not allowed to have, because now we're haters. Now we're people who are unscientific, and we're really, apparently now we're going to be homophobic, afraid of gay people. And really, we're going to get into this discussion that has nothing to do with people who have same-sex relationships, which is really like far from taboo anymore in 2020. But we're getting into this issue of gender reassignment surgery and the chemicals that you take beforehand, and whether you should do that when you're 12, 13, or 14. We're going to get into this totally verboten conversation, and let's listen to the interview.
A court in the UK recently ruled that children 16 years and younger cannot be prescribed puberty-blocking hormone drugs, and the US needs to take notice. Nicole Russell, a Daily Signal contributor, and I recently spoke on the Problematic Women podcast about this case and the impact the transgender craze is having on people across the nation. We are so excited to share that interview with you here on today's show. Stay tuned for my conversation with Nicole Russell as we discuss the impact of the transgender movement on young people and society as a whole. I do want to give our audience just a quick heads up that some of the content of the following interview is sensitive. I'm joined by Nicole Russell, a journalist and a contributor at the Daily Signal. Nicole, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So one of the issues that we try to really consistently cover on this show is the transgender movement, and specifically how that movement affects children and women. Nicole, as a journalist, you cover this issue pretty extensively. Of course, over the past several years, we have seen a really major spike in individuals, and particularly young women, coming out as transgender, taking hormones, puberty blockers, and even in some instances having those physically altering surgeries. You recently wrote a piece for the Daily Signal titled UK Issues Landmark Ruling Protecting Kids from Life-Altering Hormone Replacement Therapy. Can you explain this lawsuit in the UK that you wrote about and what that landmark ruling was?
Absolutely. So in the UK, there is a gender clinic called the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust. They're the only, clinic in the UK that facilitates transitions, I guess you could call them, to another gender. And there was a young woman named Kira Bell who went to the clinic when she was about 16. She told them that she wanted to transition to male, and they helped her start that process. So she did some hormonal replacement therapy where she started taking cross hormones. She started taking testosterone, and I believe she also had a mastectomy, and so she could begin, this quote unquote medical transition toward male. And then she learned, over time, she decided she did not want to be a male. She did not want to live that way, and she regretted the transition that she had done. She regretted the changes she'd made through puberty blockers and hormones and through surgery. And so she actually sued this gender clinic, and the case eventually, as cases do here, worked its way up to their high court, and the high court found last week that what the gender clinic had done in facilitating her transition was wrong. And they basically ruled that going forward, this clinic cannot help children under the age of 16 do transitions like this anymore, because they used her testimony, they reviewed her testimony, and basically came to the decision that children under 16 cannot understand the ramifications of taking testosterone or estrogen or puberty blockers or anything else. And so they don't know what they're doing to their bodies. They don't understand that these choices are, in most cases, life-altering and unable to be reversed. And so they decided to basically, ban them, or ban the clinic from being able to do them. And so now she said about the ruling, and I wrote this in my piece, that she was very pleased with their decision, and she feels like it will help young people as they kind of navigate these waters. So I think as far as it relates to the United States, the UK has always been slightly ahead of us in terms of the culture war, in terms of the transgender issue. They've been very sort of welcoming to the concept of people transitioning. And so I think this is a huge step toward protecting children from making decisions that would alter their bodily chemistry for life.
Yeah, it's definitely incredible to see the UK make this decision, and I really hope that the U.S. is paying attention, because in some states in America, kids can start receiving these drugs without parental consent as young as 15, even 13 years old. They can begin taking these drugs that will literally alter their body, potentially for forever, do irreversible damage.
Yes, it's been really frustrating to observe, the transgender movement as a whole first began, I think, just as a frustration maybe among adults, and you watched adults transition slowly, and I think now it's really has moved to teenagers, and it has become, as Abigail Schreier talks about in her book, kind of a contagion. It's really spread almost as like the cool thing to do, and so teenagers are making these choices, and doctors are often, letting them make decisions to change their bodily chemistry in a way that can't be undone. There's hundreds and hundreds of detransitioners out there. In fact, there was a piece in a London newspaper a few weeks ago, maybe a few months ago, about detransitioners who have decided, we tried to transition and we realized it was a mistake, and now their body is somewhere between male and female. And so I think in the United States, it's definitely something we want to look for. I know there's been legislation put forth to try to, put caps on at least these age ranges so that we can, protect minors from doing something they will regret, because we've found as we've researched this and as time has gone on that often teenagers, if they receive therapy and if they just don't do any of the transitioning, the medical transitions, that they often sort of come out of this phase and they realize, like in their 20s, okay, they don't want to live like that anymore. And that's what we want to try to prevent here in the U.S., and I hope that we can look at the U.K. as an example and hold firm on this issue.
I think that that's what made Cara Bell's testimony so incredibly powerful, is she raised that. She said, I just wish that, doctors, people around me would have pushed me a little bit more of like, okay, why do you actually want to take those steps? But she brought up that one of the things that really motivated her to keep going down this path of transitioning was encouragement that she received from the internet.
You find this interview on Daily Signal, and it's a fascinating interview. We'll just leave it right there, and we're going to go on with some more subject matter. But I really find it reprehensible and totally demoralizing, and really that's when I start to use the word perversity, because we're getting into a level of perversity here that I think is just unconscionable, and it's just disgusting. And it doesn't have to do with social mores. It has to do with really constructively understanding what human morality and human decency is all about. So it reminds me of Pete Buttigieg when he went and had and look, I look at him as probably falling into the classification of one of these couples who's healthy, well-adjusted, making a decision that they are in love. They're a same-sex couple. They can't live without each other. They're virtually married as far as we understand matrimony to be. And even though this goes against the grain of some of our kind of Judeo-Christian ideas or what have you, this is what American freedom is all about. They live in a country where they're free to live their best life now and to be happy and to pursue happiness. So if this is what happiness is for them, then so be it. But when you bring a little 8 or 9-year-old boy out onto the stage who says that he's he's homosexual, and he's obviously being under the influence of homosexual people that are around him that have proliferated this whole idea into his mind, so that he's being sexualized as a little boy, it's really a form of child abuse. So that a little 9-year-old boy can't just grow up with his little G.I. Joes and Transformers or play dolls or just play as a little boy, but he has to be inculcated with all these ideas about sexuality and where our sexual genitals go, and it's really just, it's inappropriate. It's inappropriate to inculcate sexuality to a 9-year-old boy in a heterosexual world, and it's also inappropriate to do it in a homosexual way. I mean, little 8, 9-year-old boys should be little 8, 9-year-old boys. They shouldn't have their minds laden with these ideas about politics and sexuality. It's absolutely child abuse. It's actually like almost a form of child molestation. I mean, kids are going to grow up and understand that some families have a mom and a dad, and some families have 2 mommies, and beyond that point, when you're trying to pressure a kid to express his gender identity or his sexual orientation when he's 9 and he hasn't even gone through puberty yet. I mean, this is a little boy who functionally isn't even sexually functional at 9. He hasn't even hit puberty. This is a 9-year-old boy who's just really just following along with the adult influence around him, and it's absolutely reprehensible, and it's horrifying. It's really just horrifying. Let's just put it out there. You have no right to sexualize or homosexualize a little 9-year-old boy. Okay, and for him to decide that he's going to have these kind of partners when he gets older, after he goes through puberty, after he actually becomes sexually active, sexually functional, when he becomes past adolescence, and he goes in this, we're talking, we haven't even hit prom yet. And this kid is on the stage in the presidential election waving and telling everyone that he's gay, and he's receiving adulation and positive attention to affirm that he's making a good life decision. But what we'll find out is that there's a high level of desistance, and we'll probably find out later on in a news article that the same little boy is going to grow up and happily marry Sally and have children, and he'll desist from all this propaganda that was put into his head when he was younger. He'll probably grow up and find out that he's attracted to women, as almost all men are. And so that's what we're really discussing here, is that ultimately, if you're a man and you're growing up in the world, for whatever reason you don't find women attractive, then ultimately, from my point of view, there's something wrong with you, okay? Because we were designed, and ultimately, if you don't like that, if you don't like the idea that there was a deity that designed all of this, then ultimately we evolved over time to have a corresponding mate, so that we have our entire mammalian physiology is constructed to be male and female. And so in this attraction between male and female, and that's going to be a hormonal response in our physiology, so it's going to be pheromones, which are not detectable, and these ultimately are going to be the things that drive us towards this attraction. So on some level, are there people out there that are attracted to the same sex based on genetic differences, based on physiological differences within them that drive that? That's very possible. But there's also people out there who are being driven to same-sex attraction because of emotional development disorders. And all we have to do is look to psychoanalysis to understand that some people have psychological and neurotic tendencies that allow them to feel inadequate in their own masculinity or in their own femininity in some cases, and because of these underlying insecurities are driven towards homosexual relationships. And in a lot of cases, people are going to therapy, and they're getting their urges towards same-sex attraction addressed in therapy because they would like to have attraction to opposite sex. So this whole conversation is a lot more convoluted than it appears. I'm here trying to pick on people because of the way that they choose to live and their lifestyles. We're here to point out that in many cases, this whole political correctness kind of scheme that disallows any kind of healthy criticism of psychological disabilities and illnesses that people are dealing with is really unhelpful, and it's really ultimately unhealthy. Ultimately, we have to be able to recognize when people are having a tough time. And in this case, when people are 14 or 15 years old and they don't know anything about who they are yet or their lives, and they haven't even finished developing as children, and we're already coming out as an entire society and as a culture and across the internet and as far as the medical establishment, and we're positively affirming that these kids should, go ahead, what the hell? Go ahead and just have your gender reassigned. It's no big deal. It's like taking an Advil. It's like just, it's like having some kind of augmentation done. Maybe have your nose fixed. Maybe just change your gender a little bit, take these hormones, and totally just, change your body forever. And then when these kids grow up and later on, they want to have a high level of desistance. I mean, what's the desistance rate? Up to like 80% of people when they're young and they think that they're one gender, or you're a little boy and you like to play with Barbie, and then you grow up and you recognize that you're attracted to Barbie. Ultimately, you shouldn't have in between there taken a bunch of gender reassigning chemicals that turned your body into something else when you're not even fully formed. Your brain isn't even fully developed. And so this is the kind of area we need to get into. We need to have the courage to be able to get into this discussion, and instead of hiding behind politics, and let's be real, these artifices, these kind of ways of understanding people's lifestyles have been highly politicized. They're highly protected so that every kind of derangement and sexual deviation can be kind of masked underneath this cloud of LGBTQ. And we need to be able to look at people and say, you know what, your particular preference, your sexual preference and your lifestyle has nothing to do with the fact that you don't have a right to injure these children, you don't have a right to sexualize these children, and you don't have a right to carry on in some kind of maniacal mental illness or unhealthy psychological condition and just carry on as if everything is normal. It's not really normal or healthy for you to cut your body up in order to try to feel better about yourself. And ultimately, these kind of changes, these permanent surgical changes to your body could lead to you to being terribly unhappy and more miserable than you ever were before, and now there's no way to address it. So people who are having gender dysmorphia, who feel like that they should be a different gender, it doesn't help them to cut their body up to try to fit their ideas of who they should be. Because ultimately, who they should be inside is a mental, psychological state that needs to be addressed through therapy. And so if we just skip the therapy, we skip the part of being rational and discussing what are the underlying causes for somebody's feelings of inadequacy or their feeling of gender dysmorphia that allows them to feel like that. There's some people out there who probably feel like that they should touch kids inappropriately. But we don't just say, well, then, you know what, by all means, then go ahead and act that out and just go ahead and just have that unhealthy, illegal, criminal behavior, just act it out on children because that's how you feel. We address them. We say, you know what, these feelings you have are unhealthy and they're deviated and they're perverted, and you need to be medically handled for your illness. You need to have this illness medically addressed through counseling, psychotherapy, through different levels of psychiatric care. And so on the same level, when we have a 14-year-old girl who's trying to be accepted by her peer culture, who's trying to be loved, who's trying to get a sense of who she is in the world and society, and she finds a subculture, a peer group that tells her that maybe she should just change her gender and she'll really be happy. And ultimately, a lot of these people are experiencing a kick, a dopamine release from taking testosterone, and it takes away some depression, and it makes people kind of feel emotionally like they're more stable. And these are the kind of things that ultimately the medical establishment and the entire society and the court and the classroom should be able to say, you know what, why don't you take a few minutes and think about it? Why don't you take a few years and just find out who you really are before you just decide that you're going to change your sexual gender? And ultimately, this is the kind of abuse and debasement of our with coming into our society that's so reckless and so destructive. And we really need to be able to have the courage to push back on what people tell us is acceptable, politically correct, culturally acceptable norms, and really just think for ourselves and think about our children's happiness and think about what's happening to our young people. And so these are kids, these are children who shouldn't be molested, and they shouldn't be corrupted, and they shouldn't be being encouraged to change their gender when they're just children in the middle of adolescence. A lot of pseudoscience out there too that is just kind of floating around, and it kind of makes it where you have the leftists, radicals, and these are going to be like neo-Jacobin style paramilitary groups and fascist groups like Antifa. Even though they claim to be anti-fascist, they're really just fascists, and they're running around burning things and throwing feces on cops and injuring people and stabbing people, and really just trying to do whatever they can in a Bolshevik way to overturn our entire culture. And these are the people that we're supposed to be listening to for intellectual stability and to really to tell us what science is supposed to be. And from this segment of the radical college campuses, where this whole idea of just switching your gender around is a totally normal thing to do, like when you change your shirt, is really coming from, and the ramifications and the consequences of it on our culture and on our young people and in destroyed lives is really just being silenced. So we're not even allowed to discuss the outcome of whether this is even a sane way of thinking. So you're just supposed to accept that this is the scientific reality, that some people are born the wrong gender, and we just go in there and nip tuck, click a little bit of testosterone, and you just, if you're a woman, you just grow you a beard, and now you're a man, no problem, and you'll be perfectly happy, and you'll never have any doubt, you never have any buyer's remorse, you never try to ultimately have this desistance that's going to say, I suddenly realized that I don't want to be in this condition anymore, and it's too late because you've already chopped your genitalia up, you've already changed your bone structure to be more like a man or a woman, you've already poisoned your body and done something in most extreme way to change fundamentally the character of who you are as a person. Amongst all this pseudo-scientific theory, we have this idea that, if you're a man who's attracted to other men and you don't have an attraction towards women, hey, it's just totally normal. Now let's just set aside the fact that supposedly we have been evolving, over millions and millions of years. We used to be monkeys and we used to be apes, and we evolved into these Neanderthals and into these hairless kind of ape creatures with these really big brains, and we did so evolving and changing over time because males and females were attracted to each other. And ultimately, if males and females weren't attracted to each other and they didn't reproduce, then we wouldn't have a civilization and we wouldn't have a humankind to even talk about. So ultimately, when it comes to the birds and the bees, just the pure, basic, scientific, biological facts of life, every creature out there, unless they're asexual like worms, every creature out there has to find a mate that they're attracted to so that they can reproduce and that they can carry on their actual species. So ultimately, this idea that it's totally natural for us to deviate as a culture and as an animal and to turn aside from being attracted to the opposite sex and to somehow be sexually attracted to the same sex doesn't produce a sexual result. It doesn't produce the pairing of genetic materials. It doesn't reproduce offspring. Okay, so ultimately, if you're not attracted to the opposite sex, then it's not sex. It's not sexuality. Maybe you're, having an orgasmic experience. Maybe you're having a masturbatory experience with a partner who's the same sex, but you can't really actually call that a sexual experience in reality, because in order for there to be sexes or sexuality, you have to have a male and a female. You have to have gender opposites. So let's just get into reality and stop trying to make things as we want it to be, opposed to actually how things actually stand. And ultimately, when we started to get into the scientific question here, we have to recognize that on some level, people ultimately aren't deciding to become gay on their own, but there are contributing factors. So many times, what we're finding through science is that if you're the youngest son in a family, you're most likely going to be the one who's most likely going to choose to become gay. So what we're finding is that there's many factors, like a lack of affection by a male in the home, a male family member, and so that people grow up and when they're young, before they're sexualized, when they're 8 and 9, before they have any sexual feelings, and they have a deep need for male, or in some cases, if it's the case of the female attention. So if you're a young man and you're the youngest son and you don't get very much attention from your father, then you craved male attention, and as you came up into your adolescence and you started to have sexual feelings, you started to desire male attention, and ultimately you develop a homosexual orientation because of issues surrounding nurture rather than issues surrounding nature. So if you had a big absence of a male role model, of a male attention and a male affection, and you deeply craved it, which is perfectly normal when you're a child developing, then ultimately, as you got older, you might seek to fill that space of love that you missed with another male. So this is the reason why people are going to choose to have, in many cases, a homosexual lifestyle, is not because they were born this way, but because ultimately they lacked their nurturing from a male figure in the home. This whole discussion is completely outrageous to some people who are on the political left. They consider this to be some kind of hate speech, and we're really endangering people who have a different orientation because we're eliminating their ability to be expressed as a whole person in society, and all this kind of rhetoric. To examine the issue free of superstition, let's look at this article here on TND Online. This is pretty much a good baseline of what we're going to see out there if you look at the research. Research has repeatedly shown that older brothers increase the odds of homosexuality in later born males, so that's younger brothers. This phenomenon has been called the fraternal birth order effect. The most highly developed explanation of this phenomenon is the maternal immune hypothesis, which proposes that the fraternal birth order effect reflects the progressive immunization of some mothers to male-specific antigens by each succeeding male fetus, and that concomitantly increasing effects of anti-male antibodies on the sexual differentiation of the brain and each succeeding male fetus. Recent studies indicate that older brothers increase the odds of homosexuality in right-handed males, but not in non-right-handed males. So this is not occurring as much in left-handed males. The recent article explores how the maternal immune hypothesis might be extended or modified to account for the apparent interaction of older brothers and handedness. Two possibilities are considered. Non-right-handed fetuses are insensitive to the presence of maternal anti-male antibodies, and mothers of non-right-handed fetuses do not produce anti-male antibodies. So it's interesting that they're going to really get into the science of this whole discussion. And it's fascinating that they're finding that if you are left-handed, that this order of siblings isn't really affecting the outcome of sexuality, and if you're right-handed, it is. So the idea that somehow it's the antibodies that are happening inside the mother because of each subsequent fetus is really kind of a moot point, because you're finding that it's occurring according to their studies, in right-handed men. So this is something that is really a learned behavior, and it's something that's happening after the fact, and they're really not really ready to look at the nurture side of it. They're still looking to nature. They're trying to find some kind of antigen or antibody that's happening inside the sexual development of the fetus's brain that's causing the fetus to later become a male who's homosexual. And really that doesn't make any sense, because it appears to me that all these kids are being born with the same antibodies and the same antigens, and nothing is changing in utero at all. But really what's happening as they're getting older, they're getting less and less attention from the father, And so as they start to crave this attention from the father, and they're starting to desire affection from a male counterpart, and they're going into adolescence, they're turning towards emotionally dependent, codependent male people, male individuals to have relationships with and take comfort and find their lack of male affection in counterparts and students and people around them in the school. And they're having they're developing emotionally based homosexual feelings because of a lack of a father figure. And so that would point to nurture. So, we're not all scientists here, but I think that they're trying to beat around the bush. They're trying to find another avenue to explain homoerotic tendencies and desires within males. And they don't want to have to look to the fact that there might be an emotional, causal, psychological condition that can be addressed to overcome these homoerotic tendencies, but they're trying to find some kind of genetic basis in utero, in the mother, in the antigens, to explain the why. You're just this way, you're just wired this way. Your brain just was coming out with these homosexual feelings, and there's nothing you can do about it. So ultimately, I think we're going to find that as we follow the science and as we learn more about these verboten discussions, these topics that we're not allowed to talk about because they're infringing upon people's rights, and we're endangering others with our hate speech, we're going to find out that people are really choosing to live homosexual lifestyles because they choose to, because that's emotionally where they're at. They ultimately need the affection from a counterpart. They have this codependent emotional desire for an affection from somebody who's the same sex. And it has nothing to do with in utero. It has nothing to do with genetics. It has to do with just the tendency of an emotional lack. So we're talking about there's a causal emotional dependency within a person's psychological framework. If we discover this is the case, then we can find that people who have this kind of neurotic, broken emotional state can ultimately have these aspects of their life addressed in therapy, and they can find that they can overcome these homoerotic fixations and ultimately have healthy, natural relationships with somebody of the opposite sex. And ultimately, if that's not the case for everybody, that's fine. It's a free country. But ultimately, we can't sit here and keep ascribing genetic markers and genetic causes to things that are really just psychologically based in the nurture of when we were developing as young people. To kind of address the subject a little bit more squarely, let's listen to this really fascinating interview that Eric Metaxas has with David Pickup. So let's just cut into the interview.
Hey folks, welcome back. We have on a very special guest. His name is David Pickup. He's a licensed, marriage and family therapist. And first of all, David, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, Eric.
It's really a very important issue that we're going to talk about and that you devoted your life to. Why don't you tell my audience what it is that you do, and then we can get into it.
Me and my colleagues are the current experts in the world for reintegrative therapy. Reintegrative therapy is founded on the belief, like all our clients believe as well, that homosexual feelings and transgenderism are not inborn. They're not genetic. There is no science that proves causation like that. Some people even believe it's created by God. The people that come to our offices for this therapy experience real and lasting emotional change when we go to the primary trauma issues underneath those feelings that are creating those feelings. So the simple story is you treat what the issues are underneath, and the feelings themselves resolve or disappear. In every 100% of my clients' cases, they at the very least experience a natural, automatic, either dissipation of or significant reduction in homoerotic feelings. And that fits the narrative which says these issues are based on trauma, not something that's genetic or inborn.
Okay, now this is hot stuff. In other words, I know that as you say this, there are people who are absolutely outraged at these claims. And so what has happened, of course, in our culture over the last number of years is that people have been banned. States have banned this kind of conversion therapy or reintegrative therapy. And what bothers me, I just want to frame this because it's so complicated. we all know that sexuality is very complicated, and what one is attracted to, even what heterosexuals are attracted to and not attracted to, it's a huge mystery. But we do know that there are people who have same-sex attractions who also have attractions to people of the opposite sex. There is all kinds of complicated versions of people's sexual attraction. And what these laws are saying is, in effect, no, you are born this way and you must go with this. In other words, if you have a flicker of same-sex attraction, they say, well, that means you're gay and you've got to go in that direction. So if somebody says, okay, I've had some flickers of same-sex attraction, or I've had some strong same-sex attraction, but I'm not comfortable with it. In a free country like America, is there a way that I can work on that? Is there a way that I could lessen my same-sex attraction? Whether you agree with a biblical view of sexuality or don't, it would seem to me that most Americans would say, hey, people can do what they want. If I want to get a facelift, I can get a facelift. If I want to get a tattoo, I can get a tattoo. In other words, we have tremendous freedom in America. But what you're saying, and what I'm understanding, is that the government is now saying, no, if you are someone who wants to go to a therapist or a psychiatrist or psychologist to deal with this, we're telling you, no, you can't. The state says no. So it's just a wild place that we're in, and it's a complicated subject.
That's true, Eric, but it's also rather simple, too. The LGBT activists, not necessarily the rank and file, but the LGBT activists that are whose influence is just virulent over the country, they're actually taking away rights of children and ultimately adults because they believe, this is the foundation of everything, you can't miss this, that homosexuality and transgenderism are inborn, and that to change them in any way, shape, or form would be absolutely harmful, any kind of change therapy. Well, so the argument really is on that foundation. You resolve that foundation and the whole argument falls of what they're trying to do. And sure enough, wouldn't you know it, there is no scientific proof for inborn causality on any of this stuff. And there is so much evidence that indicates, even the American Psychological Association puts out in their sexual handbook, that sometimes people's sexual feelings change. And so why do people who are these activists, why are they destroying the Constitution of the United States in terms of free speech for children and later adults, saying you can't have the therapy that really fits your authentic self?
Well, the reason I say this is complicated is because that we haven't been allowed to have an open conversation on any of these issues for a couple of decades, right? In other words, what's the last time you heard anybody talk about the fact that one of the two people who kind of broke lesbianism into the mainstream, Ellen DeGeneres and her then girlfriend, Anne Heche, you don't ever hear much about, oh, by the way, Anne Heche is now a heterosexual and is married, and what, you don't hear that, because to say that implies that people can change, or that maybe it isn't inborn in some cases. In other words, it implies a number of things that make this kind of narrative that's been shoved down America's and the West's throats. It makes that narrative look shaky or threatened, and that's what bothers me. In other words, that even to have a conversation about this, there's so many issues, and we simply never hear about these issues. You just mentioned, 3 of them.
That's exactly right. You hit the nails on the head. And who's responsible in part? Largely, it's the people in power. And that's what means activism that I mentioned, but also the major media refuses to have the conversation. And our rights are being destroyed while all this unknowable or unfathomable information is supposedly out there, but the media won't air it. Not even Fox News.
Well, see, that's what's interesting. I mean, I personally know people, many people actually, who were once in the gay lifestyle, totally sold out to the gay lifestyle, who are no longer in the gay lifestyle. Some of them experience no same-sex attraction. Some of them still experience some same-sex attraction. But those stories are absolutely censored from the culture, from the media. And I think to myself, in a country like America, that's weird and wrong, because there are people who would get hope from those stories, but people want to say, but obviously the activists you're talking about are saying, no, we don't want that hope to exist. We want one path to exist, like it or not. That to me is fundamentally un-American, and it steps on people's rights in a number of ways.
It does. You're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. These rights are precious to Americans. And, well, let me give you for instance as well. I would fight for the LGBTs for their right to live the way and believe the way they believe they truly are. But we don't get the same thing in return. And that addresses the fundamental problem in America around free speech and other rights that you just mentioned.
Well, yeah, there's an irony, because there was a time in America, of course, when people who had same-sex attractions were demonized by the wider culture and treated very, very poorly. And I think we have to say that was wrong. Even if somebody is different than you are or doing something, you still have to treat them with dignity. And so clearly there's a lot of anger. And from that anger comes this tit for tat, well, now we're going to get ours. Now we're going to pay you back. That's not right either. Two wrongs don't make a right. In other words, if we want to respect each other, then the fair thing to do is to try to have an open conversation about this.
Exactly. And I've done that sometimes in debates with the people who had courage over the past few years to debate these issues. And it was wonderful. But it's so few and far between, I worry about the dangers of American freedoms being taken away, because people have to know. On the media or in newspapers or in everyday lives at churches, people have to know what's available to them. We can't just create a society where we get to tell everybody else what they think. That's more like communism.
Oh, there's no question. And I guess, again, it doesn't even matter what people think about the issue. Like, there's some people who could think, I think same-sex attraction is great. I would disagree, but I say they have the right to think that. But what amazes me is that if you have, let's say, a young man experiencing some same-sex attraction, and he gets the idea that maybe there's a way that I could either lessen this or get rid of it, and I would like to do that. Whether you agree with him or don't, surely you should allow him to explore that. But the narrative has been, no, it's going to be devastating. You hear all these horror stories of shock therapy, and we never get to have that conversation. We never get to have that possibility.
Exactly. And let me speak to that since you brought that up, the issue of harm. It's ludicrous. I've been around the country in about 20 states. I've heard all the, quote, evidence of harm. None of the people who testify in state legislatures ever, and I mean ever, give you names, dates, people, how, when, where, except for a few isolated cases of some kind of backwoods religious boot camps where they torture people. Well, let me make it really clear for your listeners that is not professional therapy. There is no harm that is anything like that in professional therapy. We don't electroshock people. We don't shave them.
Practice, you certainly don't do anything like that. So why does this narrative continue to get play about shock therapy and damage? It's you will never hear the other side of the story. In fact, outside of this conversation right now, I cannot think where I've ever heard the other side of the story in any mainstream outlet.
Well, I believe it's because of both deeply personal reasons and also political reasons. Politically, these activists will do anything, and when I say anything, I mean anything, to get what they want, even if it takes robbing the rights of people to get what they want. Then personally, in my opinion, as a licensed psychotherapist, they're reacting from a very shame-based victim mindset that says that these people are out to get them, people like me and my colleagues, other people who believe in churches that believe the same general thing as we do about the nature of sexuality. They're reacting from a fear-based standpoint. So God bless them, but that is not what we do. Part of that issue is their own, and in my opinion, that's part of the shame-based issues that come from childhood.
Well, so you made a comment right at the beginning of this program that you have seen in your practice genuine results in many, many cases. I remember years ago, Dr. Jeff Satinover wrote a book called Homosexuality and the Politics of Truth, and he talked about his own practice as a psychiatrist, in some cases dealing with these things. And he says, look, sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes I don't get any results. But in some cases, I do get results. And I think even if you got, 25%, people would say, hey, I would try it because this is something that doesn't make me happy. If I'm a guy, I want to marry a woman, I want to have kids. Can I get help? Now in many states, the answer is absolutely not. Now, so what has your experience been with regard to the success rate?
The bottom line is that reintegration therapy, even if you want to just call it plain change therapy, really works. Not just behavioral change, emotional change. Why? Because homosexuality is not inborn. And so what reintegrative therapy does is go underneath to the causes, severe inferiority issues in childhood, severely unmet needs in childhood for love, same-sex love, affirmation, approval, and also in at least 50% of the cases, sexual abuse has been a background for their later pubescent sexual attraction.
How many cases?
About 50. The research says 50 to 70-ish.
That's very dramatic.
It is.
I had somebody on this program talking about this. I think it was Bobby Lopez. That idea, again, is not something that one ever hears. It is as politically incorrect as can be. The idea that sexual abuse can lead someone to become homosexually inclined. That is not something one can say. It's offensive, and yet you're telling me these are facts, that this is how many percentage of people of same-sex attraction have experienced molestation, at least 50%. I mean, I've not heard that. That's kind of mind-blowing.
Right, and don't believe me. Look it up for yourselves, folks. Anyone who's listening, they can just look it up for themselves. They go to narth.com for the Journal of Sexuality, volumes 1 through 7. That's narth.com. That's
narth.com.
Right, that's the old name. The Alliance is the new name, but that's the quickest way to get there. It's the same website. And when you go to that, you'll find a lot of compiled research over many decades, including the most recent research. And those are the stories that include, or those are the research studies that include statistics just like this. So anyone can find out this information. Getting back to what you're saying, my client's experience, especially because of the new therapy advances that have come across, which not a lot of people know yet, the past 2 years. Therapy now is like therapy on steroids. It was good before, but now it is so dramatically faster and more profound because I'll just term it the Nicolosi Clinic. Joseph Nicolosi, Dr. Nicolosi, was the originator of real reparative therapy. Well, it's been so built upon now over the past few years. There's ways to heal trauma even faster and deal with those issues even more profoundly. And so the time that a person spends in therapy is drastically lower now, but their emotional experiences are emotional change experiences. When a guy looks up after, let's say, a few months of these processes and tells me, which has happened, Eric, that I don't feel an attraction to gay porn anymore. Why would I do that? Why am I trying to get my masculinity from some fantasy that doesn't exist? I feel good about my own sense of self and my own body. That's exactly what my clients are telling me.
This was a discussion on the Eric Metaxas show with David Pickup, and he is a psychoanalyst, a psychotherapist, and I just want to leave the discussion right there because it just gives you a sense of what's really happening out there, what is really developing in the world, the land of the grown-ups, in the mature world of medical science and actual constructive psychotherapy, and what people are beginning to find out about the root causes of our own human sexuality. And I don't think that we really have any room left to just totally politicize the issue anymore, or try to fit people into certain LGBTQ categories that try to redefine what is normal human sexuality, and try to really inculcate and through propaganda in the public school and in the college campuses these ideas into the minds of young people, when there is an actual, in putting aside this pseudo-science, there's an actual knowledge base of research over the course of, like the fellow said, many decades that we can actually point to that show that the generation of homoerotic feelings is going to ultimately be nurture-based, and it's going to be in the environment. It's going to be something that's emotionally developed over time and can be adjusted and addressed through therapy. And these things are available, and this knowledge is out there, but it's so completely censored by the culture wars that you're not even allowed to think these thoughts. You have to accept people's behavior as it is, and there's no way to ultimately frame the issues of these deviant sexual behaviors in a way that makes sense. So for the left-leaning liberal media and technocracy that's coming out of Silicon Valley, as they frame these ideological issues, there's really no two ways about it for them. There's no way for there to be an area where people who have homosexual feelings can go receive therapy, address the underlying issues, and begin to have a normal, healthy, heterosexual lifestyle that's totally natural. So I can't imagine why in the world we want to leave people framed into these certain formats to where they are not allowed to escape. You're not allowed to say, listen, I'm no longer comfortable. You're no longer free to discover what the underlying causes for your emotional and sexual feelings really is. And ultimately there's a lot of young people who go through this confusing state where they have to be categorized as one way or the other. They have to become a transgender, they have to become into the homosexual camp, and then ultimately they can't address the underlying emotional needs that led them to this repressed state where they're basically dealing with and grappling with only homoerotic feelings, and they're not allowed to explore the reasons why they can't find attraction to the opposite sex like their peers. And so ultimately we're really pushing people into the most unhealthy possible framework to express themselves. And really we need to get into really what is the most destructive form of this insidious ideology that's really playing out in our public schools, and that has to do with the move of many young people to gravitate towards this idea that they want to change their gender. So we're going well past same-sex attraction to this gender dysmorphia, and ultimately people are experiencing profound levels of misery and unhappiness in their lives as they try to deal with an emotional condition within themselves with gender reassigning surgery. And I can't imagine anything more destructive. And it's the same advice that I would give to women who may think to themselves, you know what, I want to just go have facial reconstruction surgery on my face so I can feel more beautiful, or I want to change my breast size so that I can, please the expectations of men who are looking at the shape of the lumps of my clothing. I want to be more attractive, so I'm going to go through this extreme surgery to puff up the fat glands of my chest so that I can look more maternal, or I can, look more buxom, or appear more, attractive to men. And I would say the same thing to women who are dealing with that. And I would say, listen, you need to deal with your own feelings of inadequacy and the feelings that you have of not feeling attractive enough on an emotional level, and learn how to find your own value and to find your own emotional empowerment without having to go through the extremes of doing some kind of surgery and altering your body to ultimately try to please the expectations that you imagine that other people are having. And in many cases, I think that women feel even more insecure because now maybe they have scars on their breasts that they're afraid to show. So they're trying to fill up their clothing with a larger breast size so that their bra and their shirt will be more lumpy for men who are walking down the street. But then at the same time, when it comes time to maybe be intimate with their husband and take their clothes off and show their breasts, they feel even more insecure about the scar tissue on their chest. So now they even feel even more emotionally impaired because they had a surgery to try to address their emotional condition within them. And this is the same kind of thing that we're dealing with young people. We can't have young people who are going to go through the confusing period of adolescence and the confusing time of peer culture, sexual attraction that develops in young people through puberty, and just suddenly say, you know what, here, you're going to just change your gender. Like it's just flipping a switch. It's the most destructive and insidious kind of ideological propaganda that's really playing out in our school systems today, and we need to be able to address it with courage, without any fear. That's what we're going to do here. So let's listen to this very fascinating discussion that Ben Shapiro is going to have with Abigail Schreier. And I think her book was banned on Amazon, even though she is a doctor, and this is a scientific book on research. They decided that they don't like that particular science. It doesn't fit with their political conclusions, their political ideology, so they're just going to ban all science that they don't like. So this is a very fascinating interview. It's a very hard-hitting, in-depth discussion, and let's get into it.
Taken down by the site. Amazon has even gone so far as to restrict the book's advertising. The author, Abigail Schreier, joins us today to tell us why everyone is so afraid of what she has to say. Abigail's book, Irreversible Damage, focuses on the transgender epidemic that has swept the nation, a craze mostly now affecting young women. That wasn't the case a decade ago. In writing it, Abigail conducted a bevy of interviews with transgender individuals, transition surgeons, social media influencers, therapists, and parents who have had to watch their teens be caught up in this trend. Abigail's writing explores these findings, as well as a 2018 paper from Lisa Littman of Brown University, which we will dive into in our episode. Today, we also discuss the harrowing biological consequences associated with self-diagnosed gender dysphoria and the medical, scientific, and educational institutions that encourage it. Plus, the battle to keep Abigail's book available to readers despite attempts to bury it, as well as if conservatives and common-sense liberals can ever find unity to speak out against the transgender censorship. Hey, and welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special. The Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Your data is your business. Protected at expressvpn.com/Ben. Just a reminder, we'll be doing some bonus questions at the end with Abigail Schreier. The only way to get access to that part of the conversation is to become a member. Head on over to dailywire.com, become a member. You'll have access to all of the full conversations with every one of our awesome guests. Abigail, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, so why don't we just jump right into the topic at hand, which of course is the topic of your book, Transgenderism, Gender Dysphoria. Why don't we start with the very basics? What is gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder? Which term is correct? Which term is commonly used? And what exactly are the biological indicia of this condition?
So gender dysphoria is sort of the preferred term now. It's the updated term from the new Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders. So gender dysphoria, what used to be called gender identity disorder, and it's severe discomfort in one's biological sex. It always began in early childhood. We have a 100-year diagnostic history of it, and it always began in early childhood and was overwhelmingly male. It was little boys saying, "No, mommy, I'm a girl. I'm not a boy. I'm not a boy." And very insistent, persistent, consistent is the language they use. And most of the criteria for assessing it, especially in small children, were readily observable. Kids, sometimes in the most extreme cases, punching their penises, or absolutely refusing to play with boys, or absolutely being attracted to everything female and wanting to wear girls' clothes and whatnot. And today, out of nowhere, in the last 10 years, the dominant demographic of those claiming to have gender dysphoria are teenage girls with no childhood history. So we know this isn't what typical gender dysphoria looks like. We know these girls are not the typical, cases of gender dysphoria, and my book just looks at why are we seeing this explosion in a population that never before claimed to have this illness.
So let's start from kind of the basic idea of what causes gender dysphoria. Now, you mentioned there is a shift in the language from DSM-4 to DSM-5, gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. There doesn't seem to be a lot of rationale for that other than just sort of politics. There was no additional evidence presented that said we're no longer going to call it a disorder, even though it appears in the DSM. We're just going to retitle it dysphoria. I believe they changed the diagnosis itself to suggest that if you believe that you are a member of the opposite sex, that is not, in fact, a sign of gender dysphoria. It's only depression or self-harm caused by that belief that is now gender dysphoria, which is a sort of weird description in and of itself. So what are the biological causes of the condition, and how is this defined? How's the condition actually defined now?
So you're right. The change was largely, they found it less stigmatizing to the patient to refer to it as gender dysphoria rather than to put the word disorder in it, in the name. What are the biological causes? That I don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. There's some research into the neurological markers of this, although there isn't a lot. And honestly, it's highly contentious area even to look into. But I really don't know the causes.
Yeah, well, one of the things that has become so sort of fraught about all of this is that the definition of transgenderism itself seems to have changed fairly radically from a diagnosable, observable disorder to, if anybody suggests that they are a member of the opposite sex, then this is in and of itself evidence that they are actually members of the opposite sex. How do we distinguish between, I know this is getting very political very quickly, but how do we distinguish between sort of the claim that gender dysphoria requires treatment and the claim that gender dysphoria ought to be treated with an entire society saying that you are a member of the sex to which you claim you are actually a member, meaning that if you're a man who says you're a woman, the entire society should now call you by female pronouns and say that you are a woman. How did that become sort of the default mainstream media-driven and academic setting-driven treatment for gender dysphoria?
One of the key parts in all this is affirmative care, which it may be the most sort of horrifying medical scandal of our time. And that is that every medical accrediting organization told doctors that the standard only with regard to gender dysphoria, so just this one ailment, is to affirm the patient, to agree with the patient's self-diagnosis. Absolutely to hand over the judgment and the prescription pad to the patients with regard to this ailment. And so you have a population that is completely self-diagnosing, that is able to demand, effectively the course of treatment, and they're getting that treatment on what's called informed consent basis, meaning you walk into a gender clinic and you sign a waiver and you walk out that day with a course of testosterone. And of course, even young girls are doing this, even minors.
I mean, that's obviously very scary stuff. Well, what is the rate of desistance among young people who seem to be exhibiting signs of gender dysphoria? I know that this has also been somewhat controversial, trying to determine how many kids who say that they are members of the opposite sex just stop doing that over the course of their childhood and adolescence.
So historically, the rate of desistance was extremely high. Among kids who had childhood gender dysphoria, the rate of desistance was over 70%. Some studies showed over 80% of kids would naturally outgrow this. We're not going to see that today because right now everybody is immediately telling, as I said, the standard is affirmative care. So psychologists are told to affirm the child. Pediatricians are told to affirm the child. Everyone's agreeing with the child. Yes, Jimmy, sorry, you're Jane. You are a girl. So because these kids are now being socialized in it, I don't think we'll see the same rates of desistance. But what we are seeing among the young women who go through this is a tremendous amount of regret. Although the numbers are hard to obtain, partly because activists really shut down and interfere with all kinds of research efforts. But we're already seeing very, very large social media groups of what they call detransitioners, young women who transition and then regret it. I think at last count, the Reddit on this, the social media site Reddit hosts detransitioners, and it was 16,000 had over 16,000 members, and that was up from I think I had checked it 6 months before, and it was around 6,000 members. So you see this population burgeoning of people who have gone through medicalization and regret it.
So let's talk for a second about what exactly happened here. So you mentioned up top that there's been this massive shift in sort of the crowd that is undergoing gender transition or suffering from gender dysphoria or claiming to do so. There's this huge shift from boys to girls. What's going on there? Why did that happen?
Well, teenage girls fall for every hysteria. I mean, it's the population most susceptible to social contagion, whether it's anorexia, bulimia, or multiple personality disorder. And of course, that doesn't mean that the illness itself isn't real. Of course it is. And, or that the, disorder isn't real. If there are people who are really afflicted with gender dysphoria, absolutely. I've met them, I've talked to them, I've interviewed them. But what it does mean is that we know that teenage girls have a susceptibility to spreading and sharing their pain and to talking themselves into certain conditions. So we know that in hospitals, for instance, they have to be very careful when putting anorexics together because they will encourage each other in their anorexia. They will actually start to compete to lose more and more weight. And that seems to be what's going on with gender dysphoria. These young women are talking themselves into it. They're with social media because there's all these social media influencers. They're convincing themselves that their problem is their gender. They're encouraging each other to try testosterone. And you're seeing whole groups of friends. The gender dysphoria is clustering in friend groups of teenage girls. So we know that there's a strong social component.
So in 1 second, I want to get to the fact that if you mention this sort of thing, then obviously you end up on the wrong side of the social censors, which is, of course, what has happened to your book. But actually started, as far as I am aware, at Brown University with a particular study. I want to get to that in just 1 second. So the first I was made aware of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is what you write about in your book, was a study from Brown. It was a preliminary study that was put out talking about this phenomenon that you're talking about. Groups of young girls who were sort of they were all experiencing discomfort in various ways and for various different reasons, and one girl would then suggest, well, I'm actually transgender, and then many of the girls would suddenly decide they were transgender as well. And this was put out by a scholar at Brown University, and Brown immediately walked back the study and then apologized for ever having put out the study in the first place. What's been your experience with censorship now that you've actually talked openly about this phenomenon?
From the moment I got a publisher, there was a campaign to have my book dropped by my publisher, to have my publisher drop me as a client, and then as an author. Then, of course, when my book was coming out, Amazon, refused to sponsor ads for the book. So Amazon refused to allow my publisher, rather, to sponsor ads. Then, journalists, all kinds of top journalists, wanted to review the book because it's an interesting topic. There is, you talk to most parents and you ask them if they have middle school students, they know that all of a sudden all their kids, friends, a huge number of them are trans, and they want to know why. And it's an interesting topic, so a lot of people wanted to review it. And all the major newspapers and magazines told them absolutely not. We are not touching this book. And then Joe Rogan had me on, which was wonderful, and Spotify employees threw a fit, and they demanded that the episode be stripped from his platform, and he's stood up to them, and so has Spotify, which has really been a huge victory against cancel culture. But you see what they had to go through, and then most recently Target.com stripped my book from being available for purchase.
I mean, it is pretty incredible. I mean, we've seen people like Chase Strangio, who is a trans justice advisor over at the ACLU, calling for your book to be banned because the American Civil Liberties Union is no longer the American Civil Liberties Union. It is actually just a left-wing interest group that is fully fine, apparently, with shutting down civil liberties up to and including censorship of particular tracts they don't like. So what is the reason that a lot of these people say that they are trying to ban your book or censor your book is because of the suggestion that it somehow threatens the safety of trans people. And we get this in a wide variety of settings. We saw this with Senator Tom Cotton writing an op-ed about the use of the Insurrection Act to put down rioting and looting in major cities, and the New York Times staffers saying that this threatened their safety somehow, and the New York Times op-ed editor, James Bennett, being canned on that basis. This constant call that things I don't like threaten me has been carried pretty far, particularly with regard to trans issues. The idea being that if you don't use someone's preferred pronoun, you should be barred from social media because you might be dead naming them and this threatens their safety. What do you make of the arguments that books that question the reality of the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, not overall, but in particular cases, threaten people's safety?
I think that the reason that this issue engenders such extremist response is because they know that if word gets out what teenagers are doing, that most Americans will be so horrified that it will be shut down. I mean, right now, a teenager can walk into a clinic at 15 and without her parents' permission, after being goaded by her therapist, her teachers, and social media influencers, she can go into a clinic on her own, walk out that day with a course of testosterone, a Schedule III controlled substance, and forever alter her her body, and she doesn't even need a therapist note. And so I think the hysteria is really because this isn't a right or left issue, to the extent that most of the parents who call me are politically progressive, but universally Americans are horrified as soon as they learn about what's going on.
It seems like there's obviously an attempt not just to shut down you, but also even parents who are asking questions about their own kids' activities. Parents are being shamed by social media. Their own kids are saying that you're a bad parent if you refuse to allow me to go get a testosterone treatment. Or parents who say that we ought to engage in watchful waiting are labeled transphobes. If you have a 2-year-old and your 2-year-old goes to school, I foresee a future here where there are going to be Child Protective Services calls being made if your kid goes to school, says they're a member of the opposite gender, and then you say at home, no, you're not, and the kid goes to school and tells a teacher. I think Child Protective Services shows up sometime in the next 5 years, given the way the trends are moving.
That's already happening. And in fact, this is probably the most egregious example of gaslighting today, is what's happening to these parents. So they will have this is such a horror to parents because they're being lied to and backstabbed by everyone. So the teachers will lie to their faces about what's going on at school. They'll let the child rename himself and let him use the opposite sex bathrooms, never telling the teacher that they've officially changed him or her with regard, within the school. The therapists lie to the parents. The social workers interfere. The doctors will supply medicine without the parents' permission. I mean, these parents are so attacked, and as you said, their friends consider them transphobes and whatever. I mean, the sanctity, autonomy, and integrity of the family is so under assault on this issue. And I have had calls from parents who say, I'm terrified of losing custody, but listen, I know my kid. I only spent 100,000 hours raising her. I know her. I'm a political progressive, but this doesn't seem right. It came out of nowhere. And I'm supposed to trust the judgment of a therapist who spent one 45-minute session with her and claims to know her better than I do? It's really horrifying what's going on.
I mean, do you think that there is going to be a push for legislation along this basis? We have seen some pushes in some of the Republican states for legislation prohibiting gender transition before the age of maturity. The kind of counter from folks on the political left has been that if you don't start transition early, then it may be too late to actually make the physical changes that make looking like a member of the opposite sex easier, that once you've hit a certain age and you've hit puberty, that you'll have developed bone structure and facial structure that is difficult to change. How do you think that debate is going to go?
I don't know, but that's such a great example of what's wrong with this. So the claim that's what you just said is exactly the claim they advance. We need to get involved and arrest puberty right now, because later if this person wants to live as a trans adult, they will she or he will regret having had to go through the other sex puberty or whatever. But of course, that's a claim that's made really by biological men. Why? Because once biological men go through the changes of puberty, it's very hard to look like a woman again. But for women, there isn't the same thing. Yes, they'll be a little smaller, but they're not going to have the same obstacles. I mean, a young woman who takes a course of testosterone at 10 to 40 times her body would normally handle can grow a pretty impressive beard. I know a lot of trans men at this point. I've interviewed them, and they pass pretty impressively, except that they're a little bit smaller. So the rationale is made on behalf of biological men, but they're applying it to teenage girls. And no one stops to say, this is where the lack of questioning comes in. No one stops to say, hold on, I understand that rationale. It may apply to you, but it's not applying in the same way to teenage girls. They're going to need the mastectomy anyway if they decide as adults. Because you can only arrest puberty starting once that's already, underway, Tanner stage 2. So it's not an appropriate rationale for this other population, but we're not even allowed to ask those questions.
So why did this become so political? Because it seems like we started off this conversation, and most of these conversations start off with like an actual medical conversation about a condition and how best to treat the condition. And there's a debate between watchful waiting and, as you say, sort of affirmation. Watchful waiting in most of these areas was considered sort of the traditional way to go about these things. And there's been an attempt, even politically there, to treat watchful waiting as quote-unquote conversion therapy, that if you go to a therapist and the therapist does not immediately recommend a course of treatment, then this is now considered conversion therapy in some places like California. How did this become so political when it really should be about how do we best treat people who have an obvious medical condition?
That's right. I think it happened in a series of lies that we allowed that we were too polite to contradict. Like we started with, this is a civil rights issue to allow them to have that medication. Well, giving someone access to a medication that could harm them isn't really a civil rights issue when it means suspending all medical judgment. Hold on. I mean, we should still subject it to the same scrutiny because we don't want transgender people to come to great harm. I mean, a lot of this medical is enormously dangerous. We don't know the long-term, side effects and implications of giving a woman 10 to 40 times her normal testosterone levels for decades. And that's what you would have to do if she becomes a lifetime patient. So we allow these, little lies to be told. It's okay. She really is a man. She is a man. Let's change her birth certificates. And then we ended up in a place where we could no longer object.
And that is, I think a lot of the mission here is this idea that, I've said publicly, obviously, that when I'm discussing somebody who is trans, I use their biological pronouns. I say a man who believes he is a woman if we're talking about a trans woman, or I say a trans woman. But I won't say that somebody is a woman when they're not, in fact, a biological woman. Now, if I'm in the middle of a conversation with somebody who is trans, I'll call them whatever they want because you don't want to be impolite when you're in the middle of dinner with somebody. But there is this broader conversation that's now happening on social media, for example, where if you point out that Caitlyn Jenner is, in fact, a biological man, should you be banned from social media? I mean, it's reached the stage where full-scale First Amendment conversations are being shut down in the name of niceness.
That's right. And, I talk to a lot of older, what they used to call transsexuals, now referred to as transgender, but they never lie about the fact that they used to, that they grew up as boys, even though they now present as women. They never demand that everyone pretend they were always a woman. This is a very new thing, and it's part of the intolerance and extremism of this very young woke generation of young, the millennials and the Gen Z, who are so coercive, who are so intolerant, who are so illiberal, and who demand you recite after them. And it really is more part of that than it is part of the, traditional experience of transgender adults who are lovely, sober, rational, and they don't lie. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of them, and they're wonderful people, and these activists don't represent them at all.
So in a second, I want to ask you about the gender ideology that is being brought to bear on this conversation. So transgenderism has become this sort of weird, unlikely flashpoint, considering that until 5 minutes ago, the number of transgender people in American society was exorbitantly low. I mean, massively, massively, massively low, like a fraction of a percentage point of the population. Now, of course, it seems like it is rising rather rapidly. You now have a huge number of young people identifying as gender fluid, which is not a biological term. There's no such biological thing as gender fluid. What is the gender ideology that's being brought to bear in what should be medical and biological conversations?
I'll tell you about a call I got from a young woman in medical school about a year ago now, who was really alarmed because they were being told, the med students at her medical school were being told to effectively pretend that let's say a woman was a man, okay, if she presented as such. And the problem with that, of course, is how to take care of her. I mean, we know that, for instance, pregnancies have been missed when doctors didn't realize that they needed to check for that because they really thought that the forms were accurate. But she was also being told in medical school never to do a breast exam on a trans man, meaning a biological woman who presents as man, because it could be upsetting to her. Well, of course, when you have a double mastectomy, what they call top surgery, for aesthetic purposes, because you're a trans man, they don't remove all the breast tissue. They don't remove every cell the way they would if they were removing it for cancerous, to avoid cancer or to eliminate cancer. So you still do need a breast exam, but there were protocols in place. It was so driven by political correctness And that is what's happening in medical schools. It's really, there's a lot of political correctness, there's a lot of wokeism, and you're getting, I think, a lot less good care, certainly from the doctors I've talked to.
There was one case I know of in Michigan where a trans man presented as a man to medical attendings, and complained of stomach pain. And it turns out that the trans man was, in fact, a woman and was heavily pregnant and delivered birth to a stillborn baby because people were not aware that this person was actually a biological female until after they had.
So I'm just going to put the pause button on right there on the interview, and it goes on for another 25, 30 fascinating minutes of a discussion that's really not allowed to happen. You're not really allowed to discuss these things. These are, the college campuses will erupt into flames in Berkeley. They will throw chairs through the glass windows, burn the campus, and tear the place apart in order not to have Ben Shapiro come out and then say these things to them, because they're totally irrational, and we're on an ideological basis. We're not any longer using our ability to think or using our intellect or using our brains at all. We're just basically trying to turn the world and the universe into what we imagine we would like it to be, rather than dealing with the facts of reality as they're being discovered as we move forward. So this entire discussion is really a fascinating discussion about what's wrong with our culture, about what's wrong with putting neo-Marxist ideological extremists in charge of our academia. So academia is no longer about intellect or learning or about knowledge or about solving problems through empirical research or through qualifying accurate theoretical information so that we can determine actual facts, but we're actually just going to rewrite our history books to say the history that we would like. We're going to have the 1619 Project that's just going to turn America's revolution for human freedom into a slave colony. We're going to reapply all of our scientific understanding to just a determinative outcome that we would like it to be. New woke generation is more interested in just really destroying the system that's before it, and they'll call it a patriarchy, or they'll call it a white fascist transphobic hierarchy of male privilege, or whatever the current mode of explication that really gets it done. That's really what we're going to be dealing with as rational thought and as the advancement of the intellectual basis of the human knowledge. Our condition is much worse for it. Medical science is no longer medical science. It's just an extension of liberal, progressive, neo-Marxist propaganda. And we can no longer think for ourselves. We can no longer treat women as women or men as men. But we have to all kowtow to this system of fascist, politically correct, ideological propaganda. And we can see it reinforced in Twitter, in the Washington Post, and the New York Times, on Google. And if you don't basically submit to their doctrination, then the algorithm will find you out and will shadow ban you, and you'll be censored by the cancel culture. So anyway, that's it for this episode. Thanks for coming back, and we hope to hear from you on the email. And you can always count on us to have the politically incorrect conversation and discuss the things that no one else is allowed to discuss. On this broadcast, we're fearless and we're courageous, and we're going to go ahead and break through some of those restrictive chains of madness and ideological intolerance that are being placed on us from the global elite. And that's really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a system, an insipid system of internecine self-destruction that is taking over our political space and our academic space.